welcome to the Dean's lecture series, distinguished lecture series. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Candace Kruttschnitt as our first speaker of the year. We all know her from her work, and I just want to say a couple of things about that. She is one of the most decorated in terms of awards scholars on gender in the field of criminology. Her work has established the basis for inquiry in a number of areas, and we've all written her name. We've all tried to figure out how to spell her name in a citation moment. So it's really a delight to have her here speaking to us. I also want to say personally, I've served on a couple of administrative bodies with her doing various kinds of tasks. She has a terrific sense of humor and marvelous integrity for academia. Candace Kruttschnitt has her PhD from Yale University in sociology. She was a longtime faculty member at University of Minnesota, where she gained tenure and became department chair of the Department of Sociology there. She, just about 4 years ago, she went to the University of Toronto, where she's been professor of the Department of Sociology there. Her work has been expanding to include study of a large number of issues related to topics that interest me, incarceration and confinement. And I was particularly delighted to review her recent book with Rosemary Gardner on marking time in a Golden State, women's imprisonment in California. There aren't very many people in the field of criminology who do work that leads other people to do work. Candace Kruttschnitt is one of those people, and I'm delighted to welcome her. And she's going to be talking to us about Strangers in a Strange Land, which should make everyone in this room feel comfortable.
Thank you so much. That's so nice. And after you said all that about gender, I'm not going to say anything about gender in this talk. Thanks. Okay, so what am I going to talk about here? This is a paper that was recently completed with a colleague of mine at the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement, Anja Duurtzwager, and a stellar graduate student at Toronto, Liam Kennedy. So it's forthcoming. If you like it a lot, you can read it in the British Journal of Sociology. So this, I was thinking about, well, what am I going to talk about in this experience? And I thought to myself, this whole paper came out of an unexpected finding when we were doing research. And so I thought, well, you know, maybe that's the interesting thing here, to talk about you've got a research project, you're humming along on it, and all of a sudden there's a fork in the road. Something you didn't expect to happen happens. And that's what happened and how we got into this project. So this is kind of just an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about how we discovered the question we're interested in, the backstory, hypothesis, data, right? Theory findings and everything. So how did this come about, this Strangers in a Strange Land? Well, in the spring of 2009, I was working with Anja Duurtzwager on a small-scale replication of David Downs' book, Contrast and Tolerance. It was published in 1988. Most of you are so young, you probably don't know it. But the book really compared the English criminal justice system with the Dutch criminal justice system. And the Netherlands always had one of the lowest incarceration rates in Europe. In the beginning of the 21st century, their incarceration rate zipped up. And I was on sabbatical at NSCR, and they were kind of like, well, how are we going to get a handle on this? They had no history of prison research because they never incarcerated anyone, or if they did, they didn't do it for very long. So I suggested there's a last chapter in David Downs' book where he has interviewed Dutch prisoners held in England and English prisoners held in the Netherlands about their conditions of confinement. So I thought, wow, we could use that as a baseline, go back, you know, almost 20 years later, and see how things have changed. So Anja and we got money from NSCR. I got a SSHRC grant from Canada. It's like NSF in Canada. We headed out to do our research. So we're interviewing these English these Dutch citizens held in English prisons. And one of the prisons we visited was HMP Bulwood, Her Majesty's Prison at Bulwood. We didn't know at the time we headed out to visit this prison that it was a prison that had been designated solely for foreign national prisoners. That's all that was housed there. We just knew several of the Dutch inmates we wanted to talk to were there. The prison was strikingly different from other English facilities we'd visited. The food service went to inordinate trouble to try to cater to all the different dietary restrictions. The jobs offered, usually in prison, the jobs are all about maintaining the prison, swabbing the decks, cleaning the bathrooms, doing the laundry, you know, that stuff. Here they were trying to create jobs that would be transferable no matter where someone was released to. So bricklaying was one of the jobs. They thought if you're going back to Nairobi, you can do bricklaying, right? And the staff were clearly proud of what they were achieving, literally managing a community of difference, but they were also acutely aware of the limitations of their project. So for example, prisoners were told that if they took certain programs, it would facilitate an early release or a transfer to a different prison, only to find out that the programs weren't offered. And the staff acknowledged considerable confusion over questions about repatriation and deportation. The prison also, we found out, had a counterpart, Canterbury, that also held nothing but foreign national prisoners. And as we started to look into this, we found out it kind of makes sense. The growth of foreign national prisoners, you can't see it really well here. The top line is the total British prison population. British nationals are the red, and down here are the foreign nationals. But what you can see is their growth has steadily increased over time, almost parallel to British nationals. The growth in foreign national prisoners in England has resulted in the Ministry of Justice, NOMS, the National Offender Management System, and the UK Border Agency creating this system where they've got Bulwood, Hall, Canterbury, nothing but foreign national prisoners. Then they've got 6 hubs, and the hubs have a majority of foreign national prisoners, but not the entire population. And then they have 25 spokes, and the spokes are prisons that each contain 100 foreign national prisoners. So the more we investigated this, the more it became, wow, this is really a phenomenon in terms of sorting, classifying, and treating all these foreign national prisoners. It also, as I began reading about this topic, seemed to make sense in light of a wide range of scholarship: post-colonialism, identity politics, risk and essentialism, and of course the penal state. All of those literatures really focus on the global effects of neoliberalism. It really deals with the question of what does it mean to be an outsider, the threats immigrants present to the normal way of life, and the expansive use of punishment to deal with these dispossessed populations. So our interests, we're chucking along looking at David Downs, all of a sudden, well, this foreign national thing pops up, really started to focus on the question of what does it mean to be both a foreign national prisoner, both a foreign national and a prisoner. So, in order to start approaching this problem, we needed to create a backstory. That is, the kinds of things we thought might be important to helping us understand what was going on. So we look at macro, let's go back here for just a second. The backstory consists of macro theoretical perspectives that have dealt with immigration, what it means to be an outsider. Meso-level research that deals with racialization. Now, why race? Why would you bring that into it? Well, 66% of the foreign national prisoners are visible minorities. Like, it hits you very clearly when you're in these prisons. So we thought, maybe race would be important as well. And of course, the micro-level research on imprisonment is important as well, right? What do we know? Who's studied what it means to be a foreign national prisoner? So we're not testing one specific theory here, but as you'll see, these three bodies of research led us to consider whether, and if so, how, race becomes embedded in the carceral experience of foreign national prisoners. So let's go forward then and start with the backstory. Okay, so Syed was studying, drawing heavily on Bourdieu, was studying the emigration-immigration nexus between Algerians to France. He argued that from the state's perspective, immigrants disrupt the national order, and that state perspective feeds into what citizens think about immigrants, public distrust, really setting in motion this notion of immigrants are connected to crime. But most important, however, was the attention he drew to the immigrant who violates the law. He argued that by virtue of his or her non-native status, the immigrant is already deviant. They've got one strike against them. And crime compounds that, creating a situation of double punishment. Scholars like Huseman and Young focus on politics of insecurity and exclusivist policies. They are underscoring talking about underscoring the public perceptions that immigrants foster more crime, regardless of the actual relationship between immigration and crime, which we know. They draw attention to the public reaction, which is to distance themselves from these innately flawed individuals through segregation and penal confinement. And of course, you can't leave out Kant, right? Big picture. Kant, interestingly, also addressed the notion of double punishment, characterizing it much like Syed does. But unlike Syed, he draws attention to race and ethnicity, which he argues plays a role in the state's desire to round up immigrants. He argues that visible ethnics in Europe have long been associated with sexual degeneracy and street crime. But this state of affairs really crystallized at the turn of the century with labor migration, fragmented working class, and the deployment of the criminal justice system to deal with these unwanted populations in Europe. Okay, so now let's look at the meso level. Part 2 of the backstory. Okay, the import of this body of research on racialization and crime is that it really suggests that context matters. That is, when and how race is going to impact an individual's experience depends upon the community someone's in. Further, as numerous studies have shown, consciously or unconsciously, when people associate crime with particular racial minorities, they hold more negative and punitive attitudes toward that group. But on an aggregate level, the punitive effects of these negative attributions clearly seem to vary with a community's context. There's a great article, I don't know if any of you saw it, in ASR by Harris, Beckett, and I forget who the third author is, on fines, the use of fines. And it was testing a cultural theory of punishment. And it was a great example of how important the community is in understanding sanctioning of minorities. But if we think this is important to our project, then we have to say, what do we know about the racial context in England where these increasing numbers of foreign nationals are starting to appear? Okay, so foreign national prisoners in the UK rose over the first decade of the 20th century from 18 to 14%. As I mentioned, two-thirds of them are racial minorities. Now, what do we know about the population in the UK at large over that period of time? Well, white British, 0 growth. Chinese increased by 7%. People of mixed racial, white and black Africans, 6%, and black Africans, 6%. So these changes in racial composition might trigger negative emotions that intensify reactions to minority offenders. As Banks and others have noted, the rising number of foreign national prisoners must be viewed in a context of general anxiety about immigration and crime, and really a moral panic about accommodating outsiders into white British society. And finally, we can say, well, what about on the individual level? That is, what do we really know about what's going on? Have people studied these foreign national prisoners? The answer is not so much. There are official reports. Her Majesty's Prison Service has a chief inspector of prisons that collects data from about 93 institutions in the UK. And one of the findings from that is that, well, the foreign national prisoners seem to feel less safe. But interestingly, these foreign national prisoners, even though they're only 14% of the prison population, they're 28% of the suicides. That led two scholars, Burrell and Taylor, to investigate 20 of these suicides. And they found kind of what the chief inspector found was only the tip of the iceberg. Foreign national prisoners couldn't describe their problems to the staff, they feared deportation, and they had problems with other prisoners. It doesn't tell us, though, does it make a difference if you're a visible minority when you're a foreign national prisoner? But we do know there's a long history of research, prison research in England. Unlike the United States, it hasn't dried up, it's still flourishing there, that documents problems minorities have while they're incarcerated. There are also very few academic studies. Banks, who I quoted before, has done one of them, but it's kind of a descriptive, here's how many foreign national prisoners there are, blah. Bosworth was theorizing about the impact of race in different national contexts, and she suggested the politics of race in England has little to do with procedural justice, your rights, your legal status as a citizen or a foreigner, but it has a lot to do with belonging, and belonging really means white British. By contrast, Phillips went into a youthful institution and was studying identity formation among the young inmates, all male offenders. And she argued that race and where you come from in England, Manchester versus the South, made a big difference in how youthful offenders carved out their carceral identities, but not to foreign nationals. In fact, she argued that the foreign national prisoners' experience was totally unique because of their feelings of dislocation being different than the rest of the population. Okay, so in summary, the multi-level framework, our backstory, suggests that there's a lot of disadvantages that accrue to foreign national prisoners because of their non-native status, or what Bourdieu would call a lack of cultural capital, the racialization of crime and punishment, and of course the interaction of those two may explain why foreign national prisoners are predominantly minority. But they don't really tell us how these experiences get played out. So we kind of got gutsy and said, let's throw out two hypotheses. One would be that if you're a foreign national prisoner, that's all that matters, like Becker's notion of a master status. That's going to define your prison experience. The other would suggest that, well, maybe it's also important that if you're a visible minority, maybe you're, as Harris put it, the recipient of a courtesy stigma. So your life is, your daily carceral life is marked not just being by an outsider, but also by your racial status. Okay. So how did we do this? Well, remember, this was part of a project. We never anticipated doing this foreign national thing. It just hit us, right? So this was part of this bigger project we were doing where we were interviewing 25 Dutch nationals incarcerated in England and 25 in the Netherlands. It was quite a challenging project. We had to first get the permission of Her Majesty's Prison Service and the Dutch Ministry of Justice to do the research. Once we got that, we could get the names of where the foreign nationals were held. That is, the Dutch citizens, where they were held in England and vice versa. Then we had to write those prisons and beg the governors, wardens here, for permission to come And then if they said yes, we would travel to the institutions. Now in England, this was huge because unlike the US, they don't have these monoliths that hold 5,000, 6,000. They have a couple that might hold 1,000 or 2,000, but most of them are relatively small and they're scattered all over the place. So we were seeing a lot of the English countryside, but, but the frustrating part is sometimes by the time you got there to do the interview, the inmate had been deported, transferred, was gone, right? So this was a lot of work. The interview schedule was based on David Downs' interviews. In other words, we talked about relations with other prisoners, with staff, conditions of confinement, communication with the outside world, those kinds of things. And if they spent time in prison in their own country, so I'm talking to a Dutch guy who's in England, he did time in the Netherlands, we'd ask him to compare what the experience was like. The interviews took about an hour. All of them were conducted by Anya and myself, and we used Atlas TI to code them. We had a set of what we called master codes, what country they were from, the offense they were convicted of, whether they had priors. Now, in this paper, I'm only focusing on the Dutch prisoners held in England. And the reason why is because of the racial variation. 80% of the Brits who were being held in the Netherlands were white. But in the Netherlands, in England, the Dutch prisoners were quite racially diverse. They were almost evenly divided between whites and visible minorities. The minorities were from Africa, Turkey, and South America, but the majority of them were of African heritage. Guyana, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Congo, and Guinea. Now, so because we're interested in experiences within racial groups, we just did a little brief breakdown here. Most of the prisoners are older. Most were convicted of drug law violations, and this is usually importing, and usually importing large quantities. Most had served less than a year on their current sentence. The only real variation is prior prison experience. Whites are almost evenly divided, but visible minorities were more likely to be serving their first prison sentence. And we thought this is important because if you're asking people to react to, what is your prison experience, if it's your first time, maybe you can have a different experience. I would expect if you've had experience in prison before, it would make things easier. Actually, the extant literature is quite equivocal on that. So we kind of were very careful when we found quotes or examples from prisoners for whom this was new. Is it because they're new, or do we see the same pattern among individuals who've done time before? Okay. All right, now let's move on to the big stuff, the findings. Okay, ooh, I want to go back for just a second. First, I'm going to talk about, I'm only focusing on the two things that Sykes told us are the key aspects of prison life. That is how prisoners get along with each other and how they relate to staff. So, starting with how they get along with each other. Both white and visible minorities were really surprised at the amount of conflict that they observed within the prison. Usually the conflict was over phones, cigarettes, or drugs. Phones in two different ways. First, they get time when they're out of their cell, they have access to phones to call family. And of course, if you're separated from your family, that time becomes really, really important in terms of maintaining contact. Even people who had family in the Netherlands couldn't afford to have them come visit, so the phone became really critical. But phones were also important because sometimes the nature of the calls. So you've waited all week, you haven't talked to your partner, you finally get through and it's a really bad call, right? You get off the phone and you're taking it out on the other prisoners. So sometimes it was the nature of the call as well. Also, there's another aspect of phones, which is the illegal trafficking in mobile phones. Now, this is another striking feature of English prisons. In the US, metal detectors, and you got to basically take everything off before you go in the prison. In Britain, they just say, do you have a mobile? Leave your mobile here, and that's it, right? The mobile, because there's really bad trafficking in mobile phones. So trafficking in mobile phones, cigarettes, and drugs also cause serious deaths. And here's an example of a white prisoner. He'd served half of a 5-year sentence for dealing drugs. And he explains that, you know, if you've got tobacco and people want to borrow it, the payback ratio is 1.5. And if you keep borrowing, pretty soon you're going to be in deep doo-doo. That 1.5 ratio, of course, varies among institutions. Some prisons it's higher, some prisons it's lower. But also, even if you're feeling generous and you just say, gee, I'll share a cigarette with a friend, right? That can result in problems, as this Turkish prisoner told us. If I give somebody a cigarette, I've got everybody at my door asking for one, right? But beyond these little skirmishes, white and visible minority prisoners related to and describe their interactions with other prisoners very differently. Whites' reactions to fellow inmates were almost what Goffman called situational withdrawal. It's almost like they were assuming our role as the outsider looking in and describing what prison life, or like an anthropologist who was studying a different culture. There's a good example here. This prisoner says, when we asked him, how do prisoners get along? Well, it's difficult. We have the Jamaican boys that are rough and tough. That's one group. Got another group that's peace and love, peace and love. They're always happy. Then you got the, and cheerful. Then you have the tough English. You have so many groups. You have to see them. You have to recognize them. It's a difference in culture, in respect, difficult to grasp. You have distinct groups here. The Nigerians, the Jamaicans, the English, the lifers who all know each other. The interesting thing is, he makes no mention of where he fits in this. It's just like, here it is, right? Like, I'm outside it all. Now, it's tempting to attribute this reaction, which Craig Haney would refer to as a prison mask. To the prisoner, he was a relatively advanced age. He hadn't done time in prison before, so maybe we write that off. But other white prisoners who were younger, some of whom had experienced and some who hadn't, prior prison time, also seemed to describe the interactions with prisoners with some distance and in some cases disdain, as this individual says. I'm from a small town, and if there was a black guy past me or a white guy, they're all people. And in big cities, it's different. They all say, yo, bro, and they've got their special handshakes and ways of dressing. And it's also in prison. They've got their pants on their knees. They wear their hats like this. And I think we're all the same. We should act like human beings. Now, visible minorities did not relate to prison life as interested observers. Rather, they saw racism, and they saw themselves as the targets of racism. They especially felt the wrath of lifers. As this was a young fellow from Nigeria who was in for drug importation. He says the lifers here are mostly British people. They claim it's their inherited. They own the place. They're not going anywhere, so whatever they say is final. That's what they do, and they bully us a lot. They think this is British. It's for the British and not for you fucking, they call us fucking Africans. Now, the interesting thing is, unlike the US, Her Majesty's Prison Service has been issuing official orders and directives on race relations since 1981. And they apply to both prisoners and staff. So we asked this prisoner whether he could complain about racist comments. And he said, yeah, there's something you can do. You can put it in an application, a complaint, to end it, but nobody really does. Everybody says, yeah, whatever, do your own time. Well, maybe interactions with staff are better. None of the prisoners we talked to, surprisingly, had very many good things to say about the staff. Whites pointed out there are some good ones. It varies between and within institutions. But overall, both whites and visible minorities' attitudes towards staff range from irritation to outright hostility. For visible minorities, the absence of common courtesies was especially bothersome. This prisoner had 6 months left, again on drug importation. He says, I'm social by nature, so I'm always saying good morning, but here the staff frequently don't answer. Some of the officers do chat with prisoners, but the majority is nothing. Maybe it's just me, but I really dislike the way they treat you here. But more serious were their perceptions of and their encounters with racism. Whites rarely mentioned this, although they sometimes mistook staff bias based on their status as a foreign national prisoner for racism. We only interviewed 2 women in Holloway prison. They were Dutch sisters who were incarcerated for, by English standards, a really long sentence, 21 years. They had agreed to drive a truck into the country, and lo and behold, it turned out they didn't know how it got there. The back was just packed with heroin. So they got these long sentences. But this is a perfect example of how someone mistakes staff's attitude toward them based on their status as a foreign national for racism. She says some staff are nice, but most they're terrible, they're key happy. If you ask them to do something, they never do it. Some staff are racist. If you come from another country, they do nothing for you. If you're English, you're fine, but if you're a foreign national, no matter what color they are, they do nothing for you. So what she's really talking about is she felt discrimination based on being a foreign national. But visible minorities did not see their foreign national status as a cause of staff attitudes toward them. In the following encounter, a young Somali who grew up in the Netherlands, he had done time before, shows how the linking of being a foreign national and a visible minority convicted of a crime really reinforces a powerful stereotype. He says, when you put them on the spot, see, now this is someone who's done time before, so he's kind of aware of what the attitudes can be. They'll show their true colors. She, the correctional officer, says, all you people come to our country to commit a crime. But I said, if an Englishman commits the same crime, he does his sentence, he'll walk out. But all these people, you're keeping them here, they've done their same crime and as anyone else, they'll finish their sentence and then end up doing another 4 or 5 months while you make a decision. That is the decision on deportation or not, right? How fair is that? And she says, well, they shouldn't have come to our country. Some staff recognize racism in their colleagues. A disturbing example of this was recounted to us by a visible minority prisoner who had not served time before. He chose not to reveal his ethnic background. He told us that when a correctional officer referred to him as a slave, a homo, and a filthy pig, another officer suggested he file a complaint. He never did because he thought it would cause him more problems. But others who have done time before are willing to complain. And this is the last quote I'll give you. This individual was telling us a story. There's some officers in here, they have racial tendencies, and I don't understand why they're working in a foreign national prison. It's a really great question. There was an issue the other day with one of my friends, a Somali boy. He was speaking to one officer. He was joking with the officer, saying, yeah, you'll be here another 10 years doing this job, and I'm going to be gone in 7 weeks. The officer overheard him say that, and then she looks back and says, the only way you're going is on a plane back to your country. So he did the smart thing. He kept quiet and put a racial form in. Okay, so conclusion time. So we drew on these 3 levels of research, and I think we can contribute to each of them. From the macro perspective, scholars who are focusing on the global impact of neoliberalism have shown that the issue of immigration can entail both the benefits of diversity, but also the repression of difference. the need to regulate social insecurity, and how the criminal justice system has been and is being brought into play. Our research shows that foreign national prisoners are exemplars of these problems, but it goes beyond that by showing that crime and race are really interwoven in issues of national security and political order. Syed believed, remember at the beginning I talked about Syed thought race didn't have anything to do with the distrust of immigrants. But we see that prisons are places where race can be closely aligned with citizenship and where both are reaffirmed. The vulnerability of foreign national prisoners is heightened when they're visible minorities. Just remember the Somali prisoner who was told the only way you're getting out of here is on a plane back to your country. So I think the power relations that accompany both race and citizenship affect carceral lives. On the meso level, clearly these global phenomena need to be contextualized. In places where crime is associated with particular racial minorities and they're increasing their presence, prejudice and punitive attitudes are more likely to appear. A great comment from a reviewer when we submitted this article was, wait a minute, the crime rate in Britain has dropped just like it has in the US. So why would there be this association with, race and minorities? Well, there is an easy answer, which is to look at the documentation in newspapers of England of who's getting arrests. And that's what the citizens see every day. And those papers show that minorities are disproportionately arrested and reported in the news, right? So the racial demographics of England is changing, and the steady growth of foreign national prisoners, the majority of whom are racial minorities, can aggravate this problem. It's also important to note that the vast majority of individuals we looked at were convicted of importing drugs, and drugs trigger really punitive reactions among individuals, and drug crimes are also more likely to be associated with racial minorities. Now those are tentative connections I'm drawing there, and we're really not testing a cultural theory of punishment. But I think the findings do show evidence of this kind of anxiety about crime and race that are quite important. And finally, on the micro level, British scholars have extensively documented the lives and conditions of their prisoners. I mean, they really are out there. Alison Liebling at Cambridge is like heading the troops out there every week. They do a ton of research in the prisons. But until very recently, they really haven't looked at this burgeoning population of foreign national prisoners or the racialization of these prisoners. And we found that visible minorities in this population are the recipients of a courtesy stigma. But in addition, because we focused on these, what Sykes called the most critical dimensions of prison life, I think we can also speak a little bit to classical penology. Remember, Sykes was the one who talked about all the deprivations of liberty, goods and services, heterosexual relationships, autonomy, and security. Of course, those all apply to foreign national prisoners. But I think the deprivation of autonomy is most important to them. Sykes characterized prisoners' status as one of a helpless child in an adult world. But foreign national prisoners must feel a heightened sense of that because they're not fully accredited members of this adult society with a knowledge of its customs and legal norms. Sykes also argued that interactions with other prisoners could mitigate some of these deprivations that prisoners experienced. Yet, when you consider the interactions these foreign national prisoners had, the whites almost none, and the visible minorities racist, it's doubtful that those interactions had any salutary effect. So, policy implications. Now, I know this is kind of a duh, but you got to put it in, right? The policy implications. Okay, so, England has had numerous initiatives against racism in their prisons, right? I mean, they've got race relations management teams in their prisons. And the fact that it's done no good means that racism is really, in essence, going uncontested there. It not only harms the prison, but I think it undermines the legitimacy of the prison service. You all know, because you had Tom Tyler speak about legitimacy research, right? When people think they've been treated fairly, they're more likely to respect individuals, even when those individuals are making decisions that go against their own interests. So the staff engaging in behaviors that undermine their own authority and authority are really creating a very volatile prison environment. And given the efforts to expand this sorting and classification of foreign national prisoners with hubs and spokes, right, you would think that the Home Office has a lot to gain by attending to the racial atmosphere of their staff in these prisons. Finally, of course, we have to say this is a first stab at this. We did not have a random sample of foreign national prisoners. But the racial diversity of the Dutch prisoners, and I think our findings, suggest the importance of further inquiry on this topic. I think if we want to understand the politics of repression and insecurity, I think this research points to the importance of doing it from the ground up. Race and nationality influence the actions and activities of criminal justice agents in different ways, in different contexts. But only the detailed examination of particular groups in particular social settings can reveal the when, why, and how of othering. Ta-da!